5 times. That's how many times my mailbox got run over in 3 months. The first time I figured it was an accident. The second time I thought maybe someone misjudged their turn. But by the 5th time, standing there on a quiet suburban street holding the twisted green metal door of what used to be my mailbox, I realized something important. It wasn't bad luck. It was my neighbors. Now, before I get into what happened next, you need to understand where all this took place. I live in a neighborhood called Briar Hollow, just outside Raleigh, North Carolina. It's the kind of place realtors describe as quiet and established, which basically it means the houses were built in the early 90s. The oak trees are older than most of the residents, and everyone pretends they're a little wealthier than they probably are. My name's Daniel Carter. I'm 41. I work as a structural engineer, and I've lived in the same brick ranch house on Maple Ridge Lane for almost 8 years now. It's not a fancy house, but it's mine. The street itself is calm most days. Kids ride bikes, people walk their dogs in the evenings, and the loudest thing you'll usually hear is someone mowing their lawn on a Saturday morning. Then about a year ago, the house next door sold, and that's when the trouble started. 2 sisters moved in. Their names were Tiffany and Brooke Sanderson. Early 30s, always dressed like they were headed to a yoga photo shoot. Oversized sunglasses, matching white Range Rovers parked in their driveway like they were part of some kind of suburban fashion display. Now, I'm not the type who judges neighbors right away. Everyone deserves a chance. But within the first week, it became clear these 2 lived in a completely different world than the rest of us. They backed out of their driveway like they were leaving a NASCAR pit lane. Phone in one hand, coffee in the other, looking everywhere except where the car was going. And unfortunately, my mailbox sat right at the edge of the property line between our houses. Standard setup. Wooden post, little decorative cap on top, green USPS-approved mailbox attached with 2 bolts. Nothing special. At least, it used to be nothing special. The first time it got hit happened on a Tuesday morning. I came outside to grab my mail before heading to work and found the entire post snapped in half, mailbox lying in the ditch, envelopes scattered along the curb like someone had tried to redecorate the street with my utility bills. At first, I just stood there blinking. Then my neighbor across the street, Mr. Halvorson, walked over holding my electric bill. He handed it to me and said, "Looks like someone backed into your mailbox last night." I sighed. "Yeah, looks that way." He glanced toward the Sanderson driveway. One of the Range Rovers had a tiny scuff on the rear bumper. We didn't say anything else. Sometimes you don't need to. I replaced the mailbox that weekend. $42 at Home Depot, another $20 for a bag of concrete mix. Dug a new hole, set the post, leveled it out, attached the box, good as new. Problem solved, right? Wrong. 3 weeks later, I came home from work and saw the mailbox leaning at a weird angle. You know that feeling when you look at something and your brain takes a second to process it? That was me standing in the driveway staring at it. Then I walked over and saw the tire marks in the grass. Fresh. And there was white paint scraped across the side of the metal box. White, the exact shade of the Sanderson sisters' Range Rovers. That night I knocked on their door. Brooke answered. She was holding a phone and chewing gum like she was in the middle of 3 conversations already. "Hey," I said calmly, pointing toward the street. "Did one of you back into my mailbox earlier today?" She leaned sideways and glanced past me. "Oh, that thing." I blinked. "Yeah, that thing." She shrugged. "I mean, maybe. It's kind of close to the driveway." Close to the driveway. It was exactly where every mailbox on the street was. "I just replaced it," I said. "It cost me a bit to fix." She blew a little bubble with the gum and popped it. "Well, you should probably move it then." I stood there for a second waiting for the punchline. It never came. "All right," I said slowly. "Have a good night." And I walked back home. Now here's the thing about me. I don't like confrontation. Never have. But I do like solving problems. And I'm a structural engineer, which means when something keeps breaking, my brain automatically starts thinking about how to make it stop breaking. The 3rd time it happened, I wasn't even surprised. I walked outside Saturday morning and saw the mailbox flattened like someone had stomped on a soda can. This time I took pictures. Lots of pictures. The tire tracks. The broken post. The angle of the impact. I even measured the distance from their driveway to the curb. Old habits from work. When you design buildings for a living, documentation becomes second nature. That's when I started researching, because I wanted to know something very specific. What exactly are the rules for building a mailbox? Turns out the United States Postal Service has guidelines. They care about height. They care about distance from the road. They care about accessibility. But there's one thing they don't really regulate: what the structure is made of. As long as it looks normal and the mailbox itself is approved, the post underneath can be reinforced. That discovery sat in the back of my mind for a few days. Then the fourth time my mailbox got destroyed, something inside me shifted. I came home from work, saw the shattered wood, the bent metal door hanging by one hinge, and just laughed. Not angry, not frustrated, just amused. Because suddenly the solution seemed very obvious. You see, when something fragile keeps getting destroyed by force, you have two options. You can try to stop the force, or you can change what the force hits. And that's when I decided my next mailbox wasn't going to be wood. Once that idea settled into my head, it didn't leave. At first, it was just a passing thought. One of those little engineering puzzles that pops up while you're brushing your teeth or driving to work. But the more I looked at that broken mailbox lying in the ditch, the more the thought grew legs. Because here's the thing about engineers. We don't just fix problems. We overbuild the solution. That Sunday afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and started sketching. Nothing fancy. Just lines, measurements, a few arrows pointing to notes in the margins. What I needed was something simple. Something that looked exactly like a normal mailbox post from the outside, but underneath would be strong enough to survive a direct hit from a 2.5-ton SUV. Now, technically, you're not supposed to install hazardous roadside objects. The last thing the Postal Service wants is someone turning their mailbox into a medieval battering ram. But reinforcement? Reinforcement was allowed, as long as the mailbox itself met the size and height requirements. The structure holding it up was a gray area. So I started doing what engineers do best: research, load resistance, impact distribution, foundation depth. It didn't take long to realize something interesting. Most mailbox posts are buried about 2 feet in the ground with maybe a small bag of concrete around them. That's basically decorative. What I had in mind was a little different. Later that week, I called a guy named Luis Ramirez. Luis runs a small contracting company here in town. We've worked together on a couple structural projects before, mostly retaining walls and foundation repairs. Good guy, solid crew, the kind of contractor who actually enjoys weird requests. When he answered the phone, I said, "Luis, I've got a question for you." "All right," he laughed. That tone usually means this is going to be expensive. "Hypothetically," I said, "how hard would it be to install a steel I-beam 6 feet into the ground and hide it inside a decorative mailbox column?" There was a pause. Then he said, slowly, "Daniel, what exactly are you planning to stop?" I laughed. 2 Range Rovers. That got a bigger laugh. "Ah," he said, "now I understand." 2 days later, Luis came by to take a look. We stood at the edge of my yard where the broken mailbox post had been removed. The hole was still there, a little patch of disturbed dirt by the curb. Luis crossed his arms and looked toward the Sanderson driveway. Right on cue, one of the sisters backed out like she was escaping a burning building, coffee in one hand, phone in the other. She didn't even glance toward the curb. Luis watched her disappear down the street and nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "you're gonna want steel." We walked back to his truck, and he pulled out a tape measure. "All right," he said, "if we drop a steel beam about 6 feet down, set it in concrete, and sleeve it with bricks so it looks decorative, nobody will ever know what's inside." That's the idea. He crouched near the curb and measured the setback. "And the mailbox?" "Same exact one," I said. "Green metal box. Same height. Same position." Luis grinned. "So from the outside, it'll look identical." "Exactly." He nodded again. "All right," he said. "This might be the pettiest structural project I've ever been hired for." I shrugged. "Call it preventative maintenance." The installation happened the following Saturday morning. Luis showed up with 2 guys, a small excavator, and a steel beam that looked like it belonged in the foundation of an office building. The beam itself was about 8 feet long, thick flanges, solid structural steel. Watching them lower it off the truck made me feel oddly proud. We dug a deep, narrow hole where the old mailbox had stood, 6 feet down. Then the beam went in. Concrete followed, a lot of concrete. Enough that once it cured, that beam wasn't going anywhere short of a small earthquake. After that came the disguise. Luis built a square brick column around the beam, matching the style of the mailbox bases used in a few houses further down the street. Decorative cap on top. Mounting bracket for the mailbox. From the outside, it looked completely ordinary. If anything, it looked nicer than the old wooden post. Around noon, While the mortar was still drying, the Sanderson sisters drove by. Tiffany was in the passenger seat this time. They slowed down slightly, looking at the new mailbox. Then Tiffany leaned out the window and called, "Wow, that's fancy." I smiled politely. Figured it was time for an upgrade. Brooke gave a little wave. "Just don't put it so close to our driveway again." Luis, standing behind me, coughed to hide a laugh. When their car disappeared down the street, he leaned over and whispered, "You realize they're absolutely going to hit this thing again?" I nodded. "Oh, I know. The whole job took about 4 hours. By the time they finished, the concrete was set, the bricks were aligned, and the mailbox sat on top exactly 41 inches above the road, perfectly compliant with postal regulations. If you didn't know what was underneath, you'd never suspect a thing." For the next couple days, nothing happened. Life went back to normal. Mail arrived. Neighbors walked their dogs. Kids rode bikes past the house. And every time one of those white Range Rovers backed out of the driveway, I watched quietly from my front window. Wednesday morning, 3 days after the installation, I was pouring coffee when I heard a sound. A very specific sound. Metal meeting something that absolutely refused to move. Crunch. Not a tap. Not a scrape. A deep, violent crunch followed by a loud popping noise. Then silence. I set my coffee down and walked outside. Halfway down the driveway, I could already see white smoke drifting up from the street. When I reached the curb, the scene looked like something out of a slow-motion car crash video. Brooke's Range Rover sat angled across the road. The front bumper was folded inward like aluminum foil. Both airbags had deployed, filling the cabin with white powder. The hood was buckled, and beneath the engine, coolant dripped onto the asphalt in a bright green puddle. Right in front of the car stood my mailbox. Perfectly upright. Not even a crack in the brick. Brooke sat behind the wheel staring forward in shock. I approached slowly. "You all right?" I asked. She turned toward me, eyes wide. "Your mailbox attacked my car." I blinked. "My mailbox attacked you?" "Yes," she shouted, waving at the brick column. "You built that thing like a fortress." I glanced at the mailbox, then back at her. "Well," I said calmly, "you did hit it." She opened the door and stumbled out, staring at the crushed front end of her SUV like it had personally betrayed her. "This is insane," she said. "You're paying for this." I pulled my phone from my pocket. "No," I said, dialing. "I'm calling the police." That's when she really started yelling, and things were about to get a lot more interesting. Brooke was pacing in the street by the time I finished the call. She kept pointing at the mailbox like it was some kind of criminal mastermind. "You can't just build something like that," she snapped. "That's dangerous." I leaned against my driveway mailbox post, which, ironically, at that moment was probably the safest thing on the street, and watched the coolant slowly spread across the asphalt. "Well," I said, "it's a mailbox." "That's not a mailbox," she shot back. "That's a concrete pillar." Now I could have argued. I could have pointed out that the mailbox itself was exactly the same model it had always been. Same green metal box. Same height. Same distance from the curb. But honestly, I didn't feel like debating physics with someone who had just driven a luxury SUV directly into a stationary object. So I simply said, "It passed inspection." She froze. "What inspection?" "The one where I made sure it followed postal guidelines." That answer didn't calm her down. If anything, it made things worse. "You did this on purpose," she said, voice rising. "You knew I might hit it." Now that part was interesting, because what she just admitted, without realizing it, was that she knew she had hit it before. I tilted my head slightly. "Why would you assume that?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. A moment later, a patrol car rolled into the street. Officer Green stepped out. Mid-50s, calm demeanor, the kind of cop who looked like he'd seen every possible version of neighborhood drama. He took one look at the scene, crumpled SUV, deployed airbags, intact mailbox, and let out a slow breath through his nose. "Morning, folks," he said. "Someone want to explain what happened?" Brooke jumped in first. "That thing destroyed my car." Officer Green glanced at the mailbox, then at the Range Rover, then back at the mailbox. "I see," he said carefully. "And how exactly did the mailbox reach your vehicle?" She pointed at it again. "He built it like a wall." The officer turned to me. "Sir." I pulled my phone out and opened the folder where I'd been documenting everything for the past 3 months. "Officer," I said, "that mailbox has been hit 5 times since January. I replaced it multiple times. I have photos." I handed him the phone. He scrolled quietly. "Broken wood posts. Bent metal boxes. Tire tracks. White paint transfer. He nodded slowly. All right, he said, handing the phone back. And this current installation? Compliant with USPS height and placement standards. Installed by a licensed contractor. He walked over and examined the mailbox base. Knocked on the brick once. Solid. Then he turned back toward Brooke. Ma'am, were you reversing when the collision occurred? Yes, but were you looking behind the vehicle? Yes. Were you using a phone? She hesitated. That hesitation lasted about 1 second too long. Officer Green scribbled something on his notepad. All right, he said. I'll need your license and registration. The rest of the conversation didn't go the way she expected. About 20 minutes later, a tow truck arrived. The front axle of the Range Rover had taken enough damage that it couldn't even roll properly. As the driver winched the vehicle onto the flatbed, Brooke stood on the sidewalk, glaring at my mailbox like it had personally insulted her. Before leaving, she walked over to me. This isn't over, she said. I nodded politely. Drive safe. 2 weeks passed. Things were peaceful, almost suspiciously peaceful. The damaged Range Rover disappeared from their driveway for repairs, leaving only Tiffany's identical white SUV parked in front of the house. And for a moment, I thought maybe the message had landed. Maybe the lesson had been learned. But if you've ever dealt with stubborn people, you know that sometimes embarrassment doesn't create reflection. Sometimes it just creates revenge. It happened on a Friday afternoon. I was home early that day, working remotely, when I heard a familiar engine start next door. I glanced out the window. Tiffany was backing out of the driveway. Now I want to be clear here. There was plenty of space. Our driveways weren't unusually close. The mailbox sat exactly where it had sat for 8 years without incident. But Tiffany looked determined, almost defiant. She glanced toward my house, then back toward the road. And instead of backing straight out, she cut the wheel, right toward the curb, toward the mailbox. For a split second I thought, surely she wouldn't. Surely after seeing what happened to her sister's car. Crunch. Even from inside the house I heard it. A deep metallic slam followed by a sharp explosive pop. I walked outside slowly, because at this point the situation had taken on a strange sense of inevitability. Like watching the same scene replay in a movie you'd already seen. Tiffany's SUV was stopped halfway into the street. Front bumper destroyed. Airbags deployed. Steam rising from the hood. And once again, the mailbox stood there completely untouched. She stepped out of the vehicle shaking her head. You've got to be kidding me, she muttered. I couldn't help it. I laughed. Not loudly. Just a small laugh. The kind that escapes when reality becomes too ridiculous to process any other way. She pointed at me. You think this is funny? A little, I admitted. Police came again. Another report. Another tow truck. Another very awkward scene for the Sanderson sisters as half the neighborhood slowly drifted outside pretending not to watch. A week later, our homeowners association held their monthly meeting, and the mailbox incident was the main topic. Tiffany stood up during the open discussion portion. That structure is dangerous, she argued. It's basically a reinforced obstacle placed near the road. The HOA president turned toward me. Daniel, do you want to respond? I stood up slowly and placed a small stack of papers on the table. Repair receipts, photos, installation permits, and 5 documented incidents of my previous mailbox being destroyed. I replaced my mailbox multiple times, I said calmly. After repeated damage from the same vehicles, the room got quiet. One of the older neighbors in the back whispered, 5 times. I nodded. Yes, ma'am. The HOA president adjusted his glasses. And the current structure meets postal guidelines? Yes, sir. He looked over the documents for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. Well, if the mailbox complies with regulations and sits within the property line, there's not much the association can require. That was the end of that discussion. The real ending came a few days later. There was a knock on my door around 7 in the evening. When I opened it, both Sanderson sisters were standing there. Brooke held an envelope. We're here about the mailbox damages, she said stiffly. Inside the envelope was cash. Full amount I'd spent replacing the previous boxes, plus the installation cost of the reinforced one. I figured this would save us all the court paperwork, she said. I nodded. Probably a good idea. They both signed a short written apology as well, something their insurance company apparently insisted on as part of the claims process. After that, things changed. Now every morning, when those white SUVs back out of that driveway, they move slowly, carefully, checking mirrors, turning wide around the curb. And that mailbox? It hasn't been touched since. Sometimes the best way to solve a problem isn't yelling, arguing, or starting a neighborhood war. Sometimes the solution is simple: documentation, patience, and a little understanding of structural engineering. Now I'm curious what you think. Did I go too far reinforcing the mailbox, or was it a fair response after 5 destroyed ones? Let me know in the comments. And if you've ever had a neighbor situation that spiraled into something ridiculous like this, I'd honestly love to hear those stories too.